The nuclear agreement between Russia and the United States is no longer in effect. And the main question is, what happens next? The topic of nuclear weapons is the main issue at the beginning of 2026. And of course, there are several reasons for this. The first of these is the Russian Federation, which of course threatens the West with a deadly strike in the event of an attack on the country. Yes, as if no one is actually planning to attack Russia, and the last 4 years have been clear proof of that. But apocalyptic warnings are voiced every week. The second is that Donald Trump, in his second term as president, completely ignores decorative diplomacy and disregards the threats of his opponents. Apart from the invasion of Venezuela and the announcement of war against Iran, Trump stated that the United States of America is the only country in the world capable of destroying Russia with nuclear weapons. The US president also added that his army possesses missiles that the Kremlin could not even dream of. The third player in this entire confrontation is, of course, China. Now more than ever, it has ramped up its nuclear activities and is striving to increase its stockpile of lethal weapons to compete with Moscow and Washington. And finally, the most important thing is that very treaty between Russia and the United States of America on measures for the reduction and limitation of strategic offensive arms. Then what's most interesting is that this treaty expired on February 5th. Now, nothing is stopping the countries from entering an arms race. What will happen next? And is it true that the world is close to nuclear war? Let's figure it out together right now. Hello, everyone. My name is Anastasia Husarieva, and while you like this video, subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments. I will try to tell you step by step everything we've learned and all the information we've gathered on this topic. So let's get started. You give us likes and subscriptions, and I'll give you information. With the expiration of the New START Treaty, that is, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, concerns have been raised not only by experts, but also by international organizations. For example, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, called on the United States and Russia to immediately begin negotiations on a new nuclear arms control agreement. This was also reported by the Reuters news agency. They published the relevant article on their website. So according to Guterres, for the first time in more than half a century, the world finds itself in a situation where there are no binding restrictions on the strategic nuclear arsenals of the two countries that possess the vast majority of the world's nuclear weapons. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which expired at midnight on February 4, 2026, set limits on the number of strategic nuclear warheads that could be deployed by the United States of America, and accordingly, that could be held in the arsenal of the Russian Federation. And Guterres emphasized that the dismantling of decades of arms control efforts has happened at the worst possible moment. In his assessment, the risk of nuclear weapons being used is now the highest it has been in recent decades. At the same time, the UN Secretary General noted that even under current conditions, there remains an opportunity to create a new arms control regime that would correspond to the modern geopolitical reality. And Guterres also welcomed, if one can put it that way, those very efforts in this area. Guterres also welcomed the statements from Moscow and Washington about the need to prevent the world from returning to an era of uncontrolled nuclear proliferation. However, Guterres emphasized that the international community expects not words, but concrete actions from both sides. And he called on the US and Russia to return to the negotiating table as soon as possible. Well, accordingly, as I understand it, the goal is still to reach some sort of consensus. Meanwhile, according to the Federation of American Scientists, as of 2025, Russia had 5,459 nuclear warheads, while the United States of America had 5,177. These figures include warheads that have been decommissioned but not yet dismantled. Together, the arsenals of the two countries make up approximately 87% of all the nuclear weapons in the world. It is precisely strategic weapons of this scale that could be used to strike key political, military, and industrial centers in the event of a nuclear conflict, Reuters emphasizes. Moscow's position after the expiration of the treaty was formulated quite firmly. Already on February 4th, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation officially released a comprehensive formal statement, explicitly declaring to the international community that it does not currently consider itself to be legally bound any longer by the specific limitations on its nuclear arsenal, due to the final expiration of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. The statement from the Russian Foreign Ministry emphasized that the parties are no longer bound by any obligations or reciprocal declarations under the treaty, including its key provisions. The ministry also noted its readiness for military technical measures. In particular, it was stated that the Russian Federation remains consistently ready for decisive military technical countermeasures in order to eliminate potential threats to national security. Well, you just saw this very announcement on your screens. Meanwhile, the international community has reacted to the end of New START with concern. Leaders and prominent figures not directly involved in the negotiations have called for maintaining control over nuclear arsenals. Even Pope Leo XIV has spoken out. He called on Russia and the United States to renew the agreement on the reduction and limitation of strategic offensive arms, which expired on February 5th. He emphasized that the treaty signed in 2010 was an important tool for curbing the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The Holy Father noted that the current situation requires efforts to prevent a new arms race and also called for replacing the logic of fear and mistrust with an ethic focused on the common good. The Pope also reminded of the suffering of the people of Ukraine, where Russian forces have resumed bombing the energy infrastructure. He called on the international community to support those affected, highlighting solidarity initiatives being carried out in Catholic dioceses in Poland and other countries to help the population endure the cold and the consequences of these destructions, which Russia inflicts on the territory of our country almost daily. Against this backdrop of concerns, it was hardly surprising that the main harbinger of Moscow's apocalypse appeared on the information horizon. Deputy Chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Medvedev, once again declared Russia's readiness to use nuclear weapons in exceptional cases. In an interview with the TASS news agency, he stated that when it comes to the fate of the country, there should be no doubts whatsoever. At the same time, Medvedev emphasized that Russia is not interested in a global conflict, and the use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine is discussed exclusively within the framework of the current nuclear doctrine. According to him, since nuclear weapons have not yet been used, it means there has been no threat to the country. In other words, it means there was no threat to the Russian Federation. Meanwhile, the further actions of Moscow and Washington remain the focus of international experts. START 3 was the last bilateral treaty that obligated both countries to maintain their strategic nuclear arsenals. It was precisely this arsenal that could potentially be used to strike the most important political, military, and industrial centers of the adversary in the event of a nuclear conflict. Reuters notes that the total abandonment of these mutual restrictions could potentially mean the definitive end of more than half a century of strategic nuclear weapons control. It is also very much worth mentioning here that Alexandra Bell, who is a former high-ranking American diplomat and a leading nuclear weapons expert, emphasized that the termination of the START 3 treaty would result in the tragic loss of over a decade's worth of diligent work to maintain nuclear stability between the United States and Russia. This collapse of oversight would create a dangerous vacuum in international security that has not been seen in decades. In her opinion, this event could be the death knell for more than 5 decades of arms control and further exacerbate the global instability that has existed in the international system since World War II. In turn, the international publication The Guardian notes and reports that the greatest concern is caused by the vacuum in agreements that arises after the expiration of New START. Against this backdrop, there are also attempts to limit the negative consequences. According to a journalist from another international publication, Axios, namely Barak Ravid, Russia, and the United States, are discussing the extension of the treaty on measures for the further reduction and limitation of strategic offensive arms for a period of up to 6 months. However, neither Moscow nor Washington has made any official statements on this issue so far. If the negotiations are successful, the agreement will require approval from the presidents of both countries, that is, Putin and Donald Trump. Thus, the expiration of the New START treaty opens a new phase in international relations. The world has faced the formal cancellation of bilateral commitments by the largest nuclear powers, an escalation in nuclear rhetoric, and growing global uncertainty. However, on February 5th, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, speaking with journalists, also made a relevant statement. She said that the United States would discuss with Russia the prospects for developing a treaty to replace the New START without any interim agreements. Next, I quote Caroline Levitt. The president stated that instead of continuing New START, he wants our nuclear experts to work on a new, improved, and modernized treaty that can remain in force for a long time in the future. This is exactly what the United States will continue to discuss with Russia. Levitt responded to another question from journalists regarding whether this treaty would be extended or not. And here, it is also necessary to remind and make a brief historical overview. Let us recall that the Cuban Missile Crisis of the fall of 1962 is considered the moment when humanity came closest to nuclear war. After the victory of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro drew closer to the Soviet Union, which, of course, could not help but provoke sharp irritation in Washington. The United States had already made attempts to overthrow the Cuban regime, and this was the failed landing at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. For Moscow, Cuba became an opportunity not only to protect an ally, but also to change the strategic balance by deploying nuclear missiles just 150 kilometers from the American coast in response to the American Jupiter missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy. The crisis entered an open phase in October 1962, when American intelligence discovered Soviet missile launchers in Cuba. At that time, the President of the United States, John Kennedy, announced a naval blockade of the island. In fact, this was essentially an ultimatum to the USSR. And for several days, the world lived in a state of extreme tension. Soviet ships were approaching the blockade line. The strategic forces of both superpowers were put on heightened combat readiness, and in the White House and the Kremlin, the possibility of a nuclear strike was seriously discussed. The most dangerous moments came on October 26th and 27th, when an American U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba, and local commanders were given the authority to act under conditions close to wartime. What allowed the catastrophe to be averted at that moment were direct negotiations and, to a large extent, informal contacts between the leaders of the two countries. At that time, Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged messages in which both sides sought a way out without losing face. The compromise remained hidden from the public. The USSR agreed to withdraw its missiles from Cuba. The United States, in turn, lifted the blockade and promised not to invade the island, as well as secretly dismantled its missiles in Turkey. Thus, at that time, the Cuban Missile Crisis came to an end, and the world did not plunge into a period of nuclear war. What the outcome of the current situation will be, we will definitely find out together, and of course, we will tell you about it. And to make sure you don't miss it, you need to subscribe and like this video. And you can also write your predictions about how this situation will develop further in the comments. See you in the next broadcasts. My name is Anastasia Husarieva. Take care of yourselves and wash your hands with soap. Bye-bye, everyone.